Hello everyone, this is part 3 of What If Naruto Met Past Hinata, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. For the first time that day, Hinata actually got to appreciate something. She wasn't one for material things, but this house was beautiful. The front door was unlocked and she was greeted inside by a welcoming rug and several potted flowers, their colors bursting in the traditional neutral palette of the rooms. She had removed her shoes and taken a pair of slippers that must have been her own from the spot in the corner and stepped up into the house with a feeling of horrible apprehension. Naruto, she called out hoarsely, holding her arms around herself protectively as she stood in the middle of the open living room. She felt like an intruding stranger standing on the glossy wood floors, feeling too awkward to sit on the Titan couch or even turn on the switch that led to a hanging teal lantern. So strange it felt to stand in that room. "Gimme 5 minutes." She heard his voice appear to her right and turned slowly to face him. He was leaning out of the door to the bedroom, a tired smile on his face as he spoke. "I hate wearing work clothes around the house." She let her eyes wander over his long Hokage's robes. Red and white, flames accenting the bottom as she'd seen a million times. She nodded. That's fine." He grinned again and disappeared into the room, the door sliding shut. "Just cut loose, Hina-chan. It is your house after all." She heard his muffled voice again through the door and blushed. Yes, her house. She looked around her and wandered through another doorway, coming to a bright kitchen. "Tea," she mumbled, walking to the counters and perusing the stove. A little kettle stood soundly on the burner, just as she must have left it a million times. She picked it up gingerly, its weight a comfort in her hands, and slid towards the sink. Before long her task was over, and also her feelings of being involved with the house, and she could only stand and watch the water boil, then brew tea, then pour it in steaming mugs she'd found in some obscure cabinet above her head. She had been so consumed with her task that the ticking of the clock on the wall barely registered with her, and it was far longer than 5 minutes later that Naruto came ambling in, stretching his Titan arms above his head liberally. She fought every nerve to not watch him as he sat down cross-legged on the floor, leaning his hands on the table in front of him and stared at a vase of flowers in its center. See careful. It's still hot," she mumbled, setting the mug down before him, disrupting his thoughts momentarily to stare through the wafts of steam and at her pink face. She held her own mug tightly in her hands, twisting it when she sat down across from him, staring at the wood instead of him. He frowned a little, but was also somewhat comforted. He may have been a few years ahead of her, but Hinata was still definitely Hinata. It was comically evident in the little mannerisms that were untouched by time or space, the way she twisted her mug for instance, or the way he knew she was curling and uncurling her toes under the table. "I heard you talked with Kakashi today. Did you find out anything?" Hinata raised her eyes to the man before her. He was desperate for information, she could see it in his face. Naruto always was rather open about his dislike for being out of the loop, a fact she was happy to see hadn't changed. In a manner of speaking, I am stuck here." She stuttered, trying to keep eye contact with him as she spoke. His face fell severely. "Stuck." Hinata felt panic set in as she realized what she had said. "Oh no, it's not that I'm unhappy, it's just, well, I don't have a way out you see." She stopped her rambling apology as his whiskers stretched back to allow a large grin. "Good. I was worried you were, especially after this morning." Hinata blushed heavily. "I'm so sorry I did that to you. I should have listened to you and not jumped to such an irrational conclusion." Naruto shrugged and through her hair she saw him rest his head again on his fist and sip his tea, eyes closing in satisfaction. "Ooh, I'm so glad you remember how to cook," he exclaimed passionately, taking another long draught. She had to laugh at his exuberance and when she did he stopped drinking and smiled. "So glad I get to hear that too, though I get the feeling I'm going to be missing it a lot." She stopped laughing and he stopped smiling and they just stared at each other for an immeasurable moment of time before Naruto reached forward and began fiddling with a loose petal from the vase, Hinata twisting her mug. She swallowed thickly, holding her breath, gathering her courage. She had made him upset, she could see. No doubt the sadness in the corners of his eyes and mouth were for her alone, a fact she couldn't bear to think about. So she decided that for tonight she might at least ask one question that had been brewing heavily in her head all day. Naruto. He lifted his head and gazed at her expectantly. She took a deep breath and looked down into the depths of her tea, ripples appearing as she moved the cup in little smooth curves. How did we? How did it all? She was blushing darkly, she could feel it as she tried out the horrible question. She looked up at Naruto, pleading for help. How did we meet? She nodded pathetically. Why yes. He smiled widely and the happiness in her eyes at her interest sparked a dull thrum of her heart she hadn't expected. He scratched his head, letting his fingers comb through his heavy gold spikes and thought, looking at the wall with a small smile. Oh yeah, that's right, began, but his face was rather sheepish as he looked at her. I ruined your flowers. Damn dog. If there was one thing on the planet that Naruto hated about being that nice boy, it was the fact he was exploited by a Mrs. Uzumari on a monthly basis. Once a month, Mrs. Uzumari left the house unattended and Chi-chan, the obnoxious Pomeranian he'd come to so passionately hate, escaped through her kitchen door and ended up in the most inconvenient of places. There were shinobi by the dozens that she could have selected to retrieve said dog, but no. Naruto was the nice boy, the one who weeded her garden for small change when he was a kid and painted a fence for her once when he was 14. Now, at 18 and a half he was chasing her dog at a heavy sprint through the city, spinning over toppled carts and knocking people down in a mad attempt to catch him. Most of the time he caused enough chaos for 6 of Kakashi's hounds, rushing into stores and under carts, flying into heaps of displays and knocking fruit all over the road. Once he'd even managed all the way down to the Uchiha district, tearing through old abandoned buildings until Naruto had finally lost his energy and called Sasuke to come help him. Needless to say, the Uchiha had not been very happy. And who could forget the time he ran to the tower? The whole place had been up in arms until soon it had come storming out of her office, holding the shrieking dog by the scruff of its puffy end with eyes that were ready to dissolve off Naruto's face. I'm going to K that mutt. Naruto cried, leaping over a crate of chickens and dashing further into the village. He was a Junin for Kami's sake, months away from being in Anbu, he should at least be able to catch a stupid dog. But there was just one problem. This time, she had taken a turn for the worst possible place Naruto could ever be expected to go running into head first. The formidable, sprawling, Hyuga compound. Hinata loved flowers. There was something about having them grow before her eyes as plucky little seedlings to tall and graceful blooms that made her smile and feel giddy inside, a feeling hardly found at home. After all, potential heiresses were not allowed to be giddy. So when she'd come across the half-abandoned scrap of garden where her grandmother had once tended lush swaths of greenery, Hinata was only too eager to overtake the project left behind. Thus, she'd secretly begun rejuvenating the little plot, nursing it back into life over many springs and a half of her summer. She couldn't begin to count the number of times she'd cared something. Sometimes she was so desperate for them to grow she overfed and overwatered them. Unlike cooking, gardening had not come naturally and she'd sweat out many a frustration on her knees, caked in dirt and fertilizer. Not to mention the bee stings. Although Shino had provided more than enough help with that, she wasn't entirely sure what he'd done exactly, but within a day the bees only buzzed around sleepily, not even bothering to look her way. Now, finally, after weeks of failures and practice and research she had done it, she'd planted irises, and they'd rooted. Irises were her favorites, they were ruffled and full and beautiful and came in enough colors to keep her forever satisfied. They were her children of sorts and she'd labored intensely for the weak, but determined blooms that had wrestled their ways up despite her lack of talent. They were perfect, though a little small, and though they were dwarfed by other flowers she'd planted and not quite as vibrant they were hers and she'd stop at nothing to see them continue to grow. But for Hinata Hyuga, life never turned out exactly as she planned, and this time was no exception at all. She'd retreated to the house for only a second. Only a second. She'd only just celebrated the small victory over something as silly as irises. Maybe she'd been too proud. She was humming one of the old songs her mother used to sing with words that didn't rhyme and tunes that lilted and slid and talked of love and war and nights and stars. She rounded the bend to her garden, though pathetic it was, and opened her eyes to see the apparent joy. And the gleaming new spade dropped from her hand. Naruto Uzumaki was wrestling on the ground, with a dog. Yes, the small puff of snarling, snapping fur was a dog. You bastard. Next time I'll tie your legs together and drop you in the river. And they were. My. Hinata couldn't find the words as she stared at the horribly CS-pled boss, the carnage and destruction. Her garden was ruined, all her irises uprooted in mounds of dirt and severed petal limbs. No battlefield had ever seen such horrors, and in the center, now stuffing the dog triumphantly into a netted bag, was none other than Naruto. Moments passed, and Hinata was still speechless. How? Oh, how? She had only turned her back for a second, just a second to get the brand new spade from her bedroom, hidden under her best kimonos in the armoire. Finally Naruto looked up, satisfied and gleaming with sweat and smears of dirt. Coming face to face with Hinata. Hinata tried not to look self-conscious as she sat on the stool at Ichiraku's, sliding her chopsticks in and out of the paper. She didn't go out very often, in fact now she hardly left the compound due to etiquette and diplomacy lessons, not to mention mounds of clan history and the endless ceremonies she had to attend just to be considered Hyuga leader material. And now she was sitting at the ramen stand with Naruto, watching people pass by in crowds of lantern ha's chatter. The blonde boy looked at her guiltily. Maybe ramen wasn't going to be enough this time. I'm really sorry about those flowers, Hinata. I figured they were just one of your uptight relatives, so. Hinata smiled weakly. It's okay. They weren't going to survive long anyway, she said, resuming her movements with the chopsticks and their paper wrapper. Naruto looked sheepish and then stared at the counter for a few minutes before flashing another look at the clearly still upset girl. Why did his stomach feel like lead? He really wasn't very used to making girls unhappy, or well, maybe it was just the sincere and honestly sad way Hinata was acting that got to him. Normally with Sakura she just punched him and got it over with, but Hinata was so quiet and she kept smiling at him like everything was okay, but it wasn't. He didn't like it. Not one bit. I'm going to make it up to you. Hinata looked up from her chopsticks and stared at the young man. He was reading straight into her eyes. I'm going to do anything you say to make it up. I'll plant anything, I'll take you out for ramen. You worked really hard on that garden and it was really important to you, so I'm going to make sure I make everything right. He left out the fact that seeing her face so pitifully sad made his insides twist up in a knot. She stared at him in awe and then looked down at her hands, flushing. Why you don't have to do that much, she whispered, curling her fingers around the chopsticks. I'd never ask so much from you. I know you'll be busy, Naruto-kun. Naruto shook his head. None of that. I'll make time, Hinata-chan. I promise. She blushed heavier and swallowed, curling her hands even tighter. She could feel him watching her with those eyes of his, peering deep down into her heart. Aye. She tried to form a coherent thought, but only raised her head slightly. Thank you. She mumbled, and he smiled that heartbreaker smile, about to reply before the bowls were sent down the counter by the sweet-looking girl to the right, and Naruto was of course hopelessly distracted. Naruto could clearly see her in his head, blushing mad and a mass of silly stutters and cute, shy words. Clusters of dirt caked to his hands as he toiled passionately over that little garden, and in the end only able to manage a few sturdy buds. He remembered the way she'd stared at him in utter disbelief when he'd sat amidst the wreckage with the squirming dog, the long and shouted apology he'd delivered as she'd started to tear up. The way she'd looked at him despite her sadness, as if he could never truly do any wrong to her. The way his words never came out just right after that, the way they ran together a lot and he found he just kept talking about nothing. And she was so patient to listen. He'd never had that before, unending amounts of just listening. But he'd never seen her so happy and he'd never talked to the Hyuga so much as he had over that little scrap of earth. And once he'd finished, he'd found out that he really hadn't meant to let it all go so soon, but that was a story for another day maybe. He didn't want to freak her out too much after all she'd been through today. His blue eyes shifted from the past to the present and laid themselves over to the other end of the table, expecting to say something to her. But the words stopped halfway. She was folded over the table, arms curled under her head. She breathed deeply in and out, a faint smile spread out over her pretty face. Naruto's heart melted at the cuteness. Hinata, he laughed, standing up and stretching, you'll be the death of me, Sweetheart. The words hung in the air heavily. Naruto stopped stretching and returned his eyes to the sleeping girl. He realized slowly that his wife really wasn't in the room anymore. He got up and rummaged through the linen closet, walking back slowly to doctor it over her back and remove the mug from her hands gently. Naruto stared at her for a very long time, trying to figure out why everything had happened the way it did. I'll take care of you, Hina-chan. I promised. He whispered and turned off the light to the kitchen, disappearing into the dark. It was him. Hinata knew it was, even though she barely recognized him. He was smiling at her. Maybe that's what gave him away. He was smiling so big, and his arms were held lazily on the table. He must have been 16 or so, and very handsome with that same black-brown hair and eyes are identical to her own. My mother's eyes. But at the same time she didn't look like her. He looked like her father. But something else, his smile was so distinctly, the way his hair was so messy, his posture. You can't stay mad, can you? Why was she smiling hopelessly now? Like she really couldn't. She didn't even know what he'd done, but at the same time, she did. She reached her hand out, ruffling his hair. You silly boy. Hinata woke up with a start, her head coming up off the table with a lurch. Her words still hung in her mouth, only now everything else had evaporated from her mind, leaving a haze of confusion in its wake. What? She said hoarsely, staring around the room. Oh, that's right. She was sitting at the table, covered in a brown blanket, her legs aching something awful and her hands tingling from holding her head so long. She rubbed her eyes tiredly, blinking them open and looking around the room once more. Last night she'd been too tired to really take anything in, but now she could see it was a small and tidy kitchen with little touches of her and Naruto so easily missed now screaming out at her like beacons. They were little things, and if she hadn't been in the situation she was in she probably would have chosen to ignore them, but they were there all right. Things like the empty bowls in the sink and the frog-shaped clock on the window sill. Things that felt like they belonged there, much unlike Hinata. Her eye caught sight of sea green DRS fluttering in the breeze and the sound of a paper falling to the floor from the door of the refrigerator. She watched it descend to the ground and stared at it cautiously before standing. Cringing at the stiffness of her legs she walked slowly towards the note, bending down and picking it up gingerly. It was written on plain white stationery, scrawled in a messy, hurried hand. Be back around 5. Food in fridge, and I know I'm forgetting something. Never mind. Naruto. Hinata stared at the small happy face with whiskers at the bottom and felt rather embarrassed by it all. In a weird way she felt like she was almost cheating on Naruto with herself. Sighing, Hinata walked across the kitchen, folding the note into her pocket, and stood at the patio door. Potted plants covered every possible space in the garden. She saw vegetables and flowers and vines hanging green tendrils from a lattice propped against a wall. In the farthest corner she saw the terracotta pot containing the tall slender flowers standing in the sun. Goodness, she mumbled, stepping backwards, spinning over a house shoe that had been hastily discarded by Naruto as he ran out the door. She picked it up and placed it beside her own, looking in wonder at the two pairs of slippers, one much bigger than the other. Shaking out her hair she hugged herself and stared about the house. It was tidy, comfortably cluttered with little odds and ends. She was surprised to find so many curios adorning shelves and bookcases, obviously souvenirs from far-off excursions. The study she'd wandered into was small with beige floors and paneled walls. The DRS were pulled shut and when she opened them, the low desk and mounds of official paperwork made themselves known. Hinata looked around the room awkwardly. Naruto's study was surprisingly neat. She walked past rows of diplomacy books and even one on etiquette, books of shinobi lore, and several others that were kept in Naruto's private collections. The gutsy ninja, Hinata said softly, pausing next to a particular book that had caught her attention. It was plain, nondescript and bound carefully. The title was odd and she had pulled it out of its nook before she had realized it. It was light in her hand and smelled like pipe tobacco. She carefully slipped a finger into it, the covers falling open in front of her. For a student, don't let them tell you you can't. Jiraiya-sensei. Hinata stared at the printed words and gently closed the book, sliding it back into its place. For some reason, as soon as she'd opened her mouth she'd felt like she had intruded on something horribly intimate, something she shouldn't have seen. Stepping back from the bookcase, Hinata took one final look around the shelves and one large book caught her attention. It was covered in brown linen with the word, Days, inked carefully on the side. In refined, but still obvious form of her handwriting. Hinata felt a stone descend in her stomach but pushed back her apprehension and reached eagerly for the book, pulling it quickly from its spot, letting the heavy object rest in her arms. She went to the low desk and sat down, brushing the long hair out of her face, and laid the book gingerly in her lap. For an immeasurable moment her hands traced the covers, falling over the lettering and the soft corners worn with use. All at once she mustered her courage and carefully opened the book. It was an album. "Oh," she whispered, eyes dancing as she stared at the first page of Polaroids. Hinata knew subconsciously she would come across bits and pieces that would be emotional, but never had she expected this. No, never this. Her shaking hands went out, disbelieving she was seeing photographic evidence of this. This life. The pictures were well taken, but to Hinata they were beautiful, incomparable, the most wonderful thing she'd ever seen. They were us, she said softly, tracing the figures in each photograph. Hinata was crying, not out of sadness, but the feeling of nostalgia that washed over her. The unthinkable feeling of seeing something you'd wanted to see after a very long time. Recovered pictures after a fire or a flood. The first page was 4 pictures, each within their own quadrant as different as the seasons. Though she couldn't have told you when or how, Hinata knew those photographs. They had been engraved in her mind a long time ago, a horrible case of déjà vu. A tear landed on the first one and she quickly wiped it off, hastily brushing away the others. Her thumb lingered over Naruto's form, stroking gently. He was sitting on the floor, but not any she'd seen in the house, putting on his boots. Just his boots, just him smiling down at the straps, pulling them on in his mission clothes, weapons scattered round him. Completely unaware the photograph was being taken. "Please bring him home safely." That was the caption underneath. Hinata felt warmth flood her heart. "Please give me another rainy day this month." Hinata stared at her own image on the page, sitting in the bathtub with a book. She was smiling too, a wide grin that looked cheeky and cute. She'd never been like that before. She frantically turned more pages, photographs of Naruto flying by, herself, Sakura and Sasuke, Ino, Sai, Kiba. Parties, and get-togethers, one that must have been girls' night out, another where almost every Konoha boy she knew were holding up team posters in blue or red, sashes tied round their heads, war paint on their faces. Even one of Gaara himself seated on the very same couch with Naruto, the one in the living room, both dressed so casually you might have thought them civilians. That one had no wish written below it, only a crude little smiley face and, diplomats at work, put underneath. But the rest all had some small plea in the white of each Polaroid. Please let Neji be glad more often. Besides a picture of her cousin sitting at her very own kitchen table with Tenten, both of them holding coffee mugs. Please let them heal quickly. Naruto, smiling up at her from a hospital bed, Sasuke beside him with a deck of cards spread in their hands. Sasuke's arm was in a sling. Please help Sakura find time. Sakura holding a baby, with a jet black mop on his head and coal eyes, on her hip, his hand fisting a piece of pink and Sakura grinning into a telephone, making a peace sign. Naruto holding a little boy with black-brown hair on his lap, a kunai held in Naruto's rough hands, the child staring in awe at the metal knife as Naruto presented it. Please make us a family. This was no ordinary album. No, it was a book of prayers. They were small, and sometimes silly, but they were penned with so much heart and love that Hinata could only marvel. Especially that last one. It stirred her heart in a way she didn't completely understand. Hinata stared at the little boy, who must have been Tetsuya, until it flickered, like static. An image replaced. White eyes staring at her. She dropped the book like she'd been burned, shooting backwards with a gasp. Hinata felt her head spinning and touched her forehead. She felt sick, and dizzy and other fluish symptoms. Standing shakily she made her way to the nearest bathroom, slamming into a wall as she went. She almost didn't make in time as she emptied her stomach into the toilet, wiping her mouth and trembling. Then, as soon as it had happened, she felt better. Much better. She looked around the bathroom and rubbed her eyes, water clung to the fingers. She panted slightly, leaning back against the edge of the tub before standing up and turning on the shower. She wanted to wash those eyes out of her head. Hinata was de-sping wet as she stood in front of the door to the bedroom. Her toes uncurled and curled, weight shifting nervously onto each foot. She was not going to stare at the bed. She wasn't. Simply, wasn't. She went a little red as she looked at the tangles of sheets and a blanket half hanging off one side. Naruto must have forgotten to make it on his way out. Hinata held the towel firmly. She just needed some clothes. Just clothes. She was not going to go into the bathroom and snoop. She was not going to. Why did the room have to smell like him? She wasn't even in the room and the scent had hit her. It was impossible to concentrate with that smell all around. Just some clothes. She repeated out loud. Just clothes. My clothes. They belong to me. She took a tentative step into the room. My room. She said. My house. Naruto said so. Naruto's room. She squeaked, her face going horribly red, her eyes squeezing shut. Mine. And Naruto's house. The words gritted from her teeth and she sighed in exasperation, deflated. I'm never going to get through this, she made, holding her hands out as she felt around the room blindly. Once she reached the closet, she opened her eyes again, and then it was only to determine that this was getting horribly impossible. She'd opened the wrong side. Inside was a messy array of clothing, all of it Naruto's. Smelling like Naruto. Looking like Naruto. Orange and blackened. Slam. Hinata shut the door and then moved her hand to the other side, pulling it open so fast it scared her. This time it was thankfully her own wardrobe, and with trembling fingers she reached out and selected something suitable and retreated from the room like lightning, the door crashing behind her. After the frightening encounter with the master bedroom, Hinata found herself confined mentally to the living room and kitchen. There, at the little table from last night, Hinata ate a cold salad and leftovers, too exhausted to care very much at how good it was. She felt horrible. Every few minutes her head pounded and she knew if she ate anything more she was probably going to throw up again. She must have been getting the flu. But the feelings eventually passed and Hinata was left feeling out of place again. So she did the thing she always did to clear her head. She cleaned. Hinata also began to realize that her logic from the past carried over into the future, because it was getting really easy to find things like cleaning supplies or hair bands and even some pain reliever. She seemed to organize things the same way, so Hinata just followed her intuition when she needed to locate a sponge or some bleach. The kitchen had been the first. She took everything out of the refrigerator and scrubbed it till it shone, scoured the stove and bleached the sink pearly white before moving to the floors. She moved the table effortlessly and swept everything out onto the patio, where she was momentarily distracted by wiping dirt off of pots. For the next 3 hours she turned the house upside down and then put it back again, making sure to steer clear of the study and the master suite, those seemed off limits no matter how many times she tried to tell herself they weren't. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Hinata had completely and totally forgotten about Naruto's note, and when the man came in, Hinata was looking a bit worse for wear. Her hair was pulled back roughly, her clothes discarded for the rattiest t-shirt she could find, pants pulled off to make way for tight black shorts that had already been stained. Hinata had actually been quite pleased with herself for keeping such clothing, and judging by the chemical smell that seemed worn into the fabric, she'd used them often for the same purpose. And as an added bonus she'd come across them in the laundry room. But currently more important issues were at hand. I'm starving. Hinata stiffened at the sound and looked over her shoulder from where she had been cleaning out under the TV cabinet, arranging videos and CDs alphabetically. She heard shoes being kicked off in the mud room, something heavy dropping to the floor, and was instantly on her feet standing in the middle of the living room. How was your DDD day? She half stuttered, half shouted due to nerves. The muffled grunt she got sounded very much like, hold on, and soon after a very dirty Naruto emerged. Gee goodness, Hinata said in surprise, taking in his rather disheveled appearance. Naruto seed his head and then looked down at his clothes. Damn it, he muttered, brushing stray soil off of his shirt before looking back up at his rather unnerved wife. He grinned sheepishly, or at least tried to. He had a black eye and a split lip. I got into a bit of a fight on the way home. Hinata felt hair on the back of her neck rise and she lurched forward without thinking, rushing to inspect him. Are you all right? She exclaimed, worry creasing her forehead and painting her eyes. Naruto smiled and laughed. Hey, it's fine. I was just helping someone out. No harm done. He stopped laughing and smiled gently at Hinata's truly worried face. She nodded, still unconvinced though, and withdrew her hands from his arm. Apparently they'd gotten there, on their own. Are you hungry? She asked tentatively, and then Naruto's face lit up. Starved. He med, meetings all day and they don't give you a single break to eat. He whimpered, rubbing his stomach with a pained look. Hinata giggled and awkwardly slipped past him into the kitchen. Wow, the house is spotless. Did you clean all day? He questioned, slipping down onto the floor at the table. Hinata nodded and watched as his face contorted and as he sat, hissing through his teeth. Are you sure you're okay? She asked quietly. Naruto opened one eye and seed a half grin. Perfect actually. That stew smells like heaven. He closed his eyes and inhaled the simmering pot that had been on the stove since that afternoon. Hinata was genius when came to using up food. She blushed and stirred it with the ladle before spooning a hearty portion into a pretty ceramic bowl. Why were you fighting? She asked, as casually as she could, spooning another bowl for herself. Naruto shrugged and tapped his fingers. Some young kid was getting himself into trouble. Can't have that. Hinata looked up and saw he was staring at her. She blinked and he raised an eyebrow at her. Is something wrong? She asked, bringing the bowls to the table. He started to chuckle and shook his head. Oh number. Just how silly the two of us must look. Right Kakashi. Naruto suddenly turned his head to the window where lo and behold, the copycat nin was poised outside, nose buried in that trademark orange book. Hataki-san. Hinata cried, jumping out of surprise. The man raised one lazy eyebrow and walked to the door where he promptly let himself in. You're quite the pair, that's for sure. Kakashi answered, sinking down to the table. Hinata just stared at him. How long had he been standing there? Had he been watching her all day? Oh, sorry. It's alright Hinata, no need to get so worked up. Kakashi eats with us on Wednesdays after he gets through talking at the tower. Hinata watched as Naruto scratched his head in thought. For some reason he always ends up getting more information out of the same people in one day than the amount I attempt to get all week. I do try, Kakashi said dryly, before turning to Hinata. You're the talk of the tower today. Apparently everyone thinks you've got some horrible disease. What? Hinata exclaimed just as Naruto looked up, a certain protectiveness crossing his features. Kakashi smirked under his mask. Seems Ino got wind you were at the hospital and when Sakura told her it was confidential, well, I'm sure you can imagine. Hinata paled. And you did what to defend her? Naruto said coarsely. Kakashi smiled. It's confidential, remember. Would you like some stew Kakashi-sensei? Hinata said tiredly, to which Kakashi readily accepted. I would give my other eye for a bowl, as would half of Suna since last time. Do they really? I didn't think they liked it that much. Naruto marveled, staring at his food. Hinata raised her head in confusion. She had since gotten up and gotten the scarecrow his stew when her question had arisen. Last time. Suna? She asked. Last time Gaara came to Konoha you ended up making beef stew for the entire embassy because the regular cook had the flu. Gaara asked for it all week too. Naruto recalled between spoonfuls. Kakashi nodded and continued. Anyway, after it became the next big dish in Suna. They asked for it so much you just gave them the recipe. Naruto laughed. You're probably the most popular wife in the shinobi world. Every time someone comes they always ask about you. Hinata blushed even more. I'm sure that's an exaggeration. She said humbly, setting down Kakashi's steaming bowl. You do wonders for the political world too Hinata, what with all that Hyuga training. Naruto said casually as Kakashi pulled down his mask. Hinata really couldn't answer. After dinner, and the initial shock of seeing Kakashi Hataki's real face, Hinata had set about doing the dishes quickly while the two shinobi had openly discussed a fusion of local gossip and the political affairs circulating through the tower. Then Kakashi had left with a wave of his hand and Naruto standing at the door with a grin. May I look at your wounds? Hinata asked, voicing the worry that had been bothering her all night. Naruto looked exasperated. And here I thought you wouldn't remember. He pouted, plopping down by the table again. Hinata smiled. Naruto may have been grown up, but he still had a horribly childish personality, not that she minded at all. I'll be gentle, she said softly, pulling out a first aid kit that she'd found earlier in the day. Taking out rolls of gauze and some scissors, she set about cleaning out the cut on his face, being as careful as she could. OWWW. Naruto groaned as the alcohol hit a knuckle he'd grazed on a brick wall. Hinata chuckled and wrapped his hand. Shush. Naruto closed his mouth and watched her work, taping up his face and hands. The kid, he was about to beat someone else up, some civilian boy. Naruto said matter-of-factly. Hinata looked up for a moment before moving up to the gash on his shoulder she'd just noticed. Naruto stared at her hands. I told him he should only beat up someone to match his abilities, to which he told me he could kick my ass. I said I wasn't going to go easy on him, and I didn't, and he still hit the S out of me. Naruto stiffened, his voice serious. I cut him up pretty bad, but it was only so that I could get him subdued. What did you do after that? Hinata asked naturally, actually forgetting to stutter. Something about his proximity, the tone of his voice, they were all almost familiar. Handed him over to Iruka. He's been staying there overnight for the past week. Sometimes he stays at Kakashi's too. Do you know this boy? Hinata looked up and Naruto's eyes were a bit clouded, but he nodded none the same. He's a street kid. I've been mentoring him as much as I can since he turned 12 2 years ago, but lately he's been getting into more trouble than I can keep him out of. Frustrates the hell out of me. He's got enough potential to beat everyone I know. Hinata gave his arm one final once-over and began putting everything back inside the box. But he's got nobody. Hinata looked up from her work and stared at Naruto. He wasn't looking at her, but instead at his wrapped-up hands. Nobody's going to clean him up tonight, you know. Hinata nodded and Naruto smiled sadly. He's a good kid. He really is. He's just alone. He acts out for attention. Like you did. Naruto smiled wider. Just like me. Hinata placed the last thing in the kit and closed the latch, thinking. You used to wish IW would act out. She looked up briefly. F for attention, I am mean. Naruto smiled and patted her head. Well, you didn't have to for my attention. I love you just for being so wonderfully quiet. Hinata melted into the floor. X. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.